Yeah. What is it that our children see? When a man and a woman is living together in a house, what do our children see? How do men and women interact with each other?
Now, the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence is an annual international campaign that kicked off on the 25th of November, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and basically runs until Human Rights Day, which is commemorated on the 10th of December. The theme for this year is Unite, Invest to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls. The campaign basically calls on citizens to show how much they care about ending violence against women and girls by sharing the actions that they are taking to create a world which is free, from violence against women, and also calling on governments to, basically just share how they are investing in gender-based violence prevention. Joining me on today's MYD Heart to share more on how we can all strive in addressing this global pandemic is Namibia Minister of Justice, Honourable Yvonne Dausab. Good evening to you and welcome.
Thank you very much, and good evening to you, the listeners, but also those that are watching us on the social media platforms.
It is such an honor. Let's start with the theme for this year: Unite, Invest to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls. Could you perhaps start by giving us a context around that?
So I think it's important that we understand why events like this happen annually.
Yeah.
Firstly, I suppose to also remind us that we had made a commitment many years ago that we will do something about violence against women and children. At the time that this particular campaign started, I think there was a very, very huge amount of issues that pertained to women's rights, gender inequalities, but also a very disconcerting issue of violence against women and children. In today's world, of course, we'd like to talk a little bit more about gender-based violence and not just focus on women and girls, because we also know that men suffer violence. But if you look at it statistically, women disproportionately suffer violence. And then just to say that, and you maybe those that will watch me on social media would see that I'm wearing orange. Part of the theme also encapsulates the color of orange. And the idea is to unite against violence. It's a campaign. You can do it in different ways. I remember a couple of years ago, actually, I was part of a Blue Eye campaign. And the idea was to deal with the culture of silence and to deal with the shame that is placed on victims and survivors of violence. So it almost looks like perpetrators of violence are glorified. They get the power, and those that suffer the violence have to kind of keep quiet in shame. Then just two last things that I want to say on this particular aspect is that the Uniting Against Gender-Based Violence, which runs for 16 days, starting on the 25th, we've launched it in Namibia as well, and we've done so every year. And the Ministry of Gender Equality, Poverty Eradication and Child Welfare has been consistent in getting the Ministry of Justice involved in their campaigns, either for us to make speeches or to be part of some form of training. But the more important part that deals with the theme, which is to invest, that means we must invest in policy, we must invest in laws. In other words, if the laws are not sufficient, we must improve them, and we must do some work around institutional arrangements.
You did mention a couple of perhaps activities or campaigns that you engage in, but maybe just break them down for us. Activities or campaigns that are run or planned by the ministry to increase awareness and just share knowledge on GBV in the country.
So the Ministry of Justice is a partner. There are a number of key functionaries in the country that deals with gender-based violence more generally, but I think also regarding issues of gender equality, because there is a very direct link between gender equality and gender-based violence. If people feel some type of way, when there are power dynamics involved, you would find that violence is the way that you would want to resolve the issue. So typically the Ministry of Justice we speak at events. The minister or any of the senior officials in the ministry are invited to participate in events. We are part of an interministerial committee that monitors the implementation of international instruments. We are, and I have certainly at the beginning of this year and towards the end of last year, I have introduced 2 amendments, critical ones, in the rape amendment and domestic violence. And the intention was that we wanted to improve the text, the language, and the safeguards that are provided for in the legislation. You'd agree with me, and I hope you do, is that, law is not enough, and law is often after the fact. It's not sufficiently preventative. One hopes, though, that if you have an increased number of, if you increase the sentencing, for example, if people get longer jail sentences, one hopes that will have some deterrent effect.
Sure.
But we also introduced certain aspects around counseling. We introduced aspects that pertains to, for instance, sexual harassment in the workplace, because that power dynamic has not been sufficiently understood and explained, and in how it works in our societal body politics. So it's important for our listeners and viewers on social media platforms to understand that the activities of the Ministry of Justice are not isolated from the activities of the Namibian Police, the activities of the Correctional Services, Safety and Security, and the Ministry of Gender Equality, and of course some of the incredible work that civil society organizations are doing in the country around prevention of gender-based violence in the country. So that's more or less where we are in terms of just some of the activities that we undertake.
Let's talk prosecutions now. When compared to previous years, how would you describe the level of successful prosecutions in GBV cases among women and girls, specifically in Namibia?
So just for context, the Prosecutor General is administratively supported by the Ministry of Justice. But you'd know that the Prosecutor General is appointed constitutionally and is independent. The Prosecutor General makes an independent decision whether to prosecute a crime or not. Gender-based violence, like any other crime, whether it's sexual violence, because there's a strong link between gender-based violence, sexual violence, and even child rape. Now, more specifically. But the Prosecutor General has, so I'm not the right person to give you specific details around their conviction rates. I know, for example, if it statistically they had over 1,500 cases of GBV that had gone to the courts, but only over 500 were finalized. What I can tell you about the Prosecutor General's office, which is important for the listeners to know, is the fact that they have a dedicated team of prosecutors that only focuses on gender-based violence. That's one. Number 2, they have what they call a gender-based violence unit that focuses on domestic violence, sexual violence, and maintenance matters. They have also a standard operating manual, and that helps with how do you deal with, for example, gender-based violence cases. When you train the police, and police also go through training, they've been trained, they have training manuals integrated into their normal police training that deals with human rights, that deals with gender-based violence, that deals with domestic violence. And rather sexual violence. And what that does is that you have specialized persons that focuses specifically on gender-based violence. And I think that's an important part of the work that the Prosecutor General's office is doing. Now, also, what is important is to understand that there is a multi-sectoral approach to preventing and dealing with gender-based violence. And that multi-sectoral approach includes all of the key stakeholders, the Namibian police, social workers, the prosecution, the Office of the Judiciary, which is independent, so that when they are dealing with gender-based violence cases, they would do trainings that are integrated. So that the response is able to deal with those issues properly. You'd remember that gender-based violence, when you report a gender-based violence case, domestic violence, sexual violence, it's not a robbery. So it has to be treated very differently. For example, the first thing that you'd want to ask a victim of violence or a survivor of violence is whether or not they are safe, whether or not the perpetrator is anywhere close to where they find themselves, whether or not they'd be able to go back home and be okay, or whether they need alternative, or whether they need to be taken to a safe haven. So it's important that the police, that the prosecutors know what questions to ask, for instance, when somebody comes and reports violence. Because gender-based violence happens in homes. It happens between two people that had just recently declared love to each other, and now they're beating each other. So even the crime scene of gender-based violence, of domestic violence, of sexual violence, in some instances, is a familiar place. It's a place that you're expecting it to be safe, and so you gotta have a different attitude. You gotta have a different disposition when the crime of gender-based violence, of domestic violence or sexual violence is reported, either at the police or at the hospital or any of the places that people run to when they're looking for refuge.
There's the reporting, and then there's also some cases where victims withdraw their statements. So in cases whereby victims report cases but then withdraw them afterwards when reconciling with your partners, what legislation is in place to avoid that from happening despite the severity of the cases?
So I think withdrawal of cases is both very personal but also very societal. Like I was saying to you earlier, because that violence takes place in a home, for example, if it's domestic violence, or if it's a rape of a child, or a rape by a family member of another family member, these are people who are living together. You can imagine that many of the people are dependent on perpetrators. In some instances, you have instances where family puts pressure on the victim or the survivor of the crime because they want to protect the family image. So it's a shameful thing for you to take out there. So that kind of family pressure, and also sometimes just shame, personal shame of violence. When you have a blue eye, for instance, you'd rather stay at home. You wouldn't want your friends to know about this. You wouldn't want the society to know that you are a victim of violence. I think there is now an increasing culture developing of people speaking up. The Blue Eye campaign wanted to do that. I remember having had that blue eye, and when I was in the papers with the blue eye, everybody was calling me. But people were calling me because I'm the Minister of Justice and I'm Yvonne Dausab. But another woman that does not have those titles does not get the same support.
100%.
Rather, people would quietly gossip about you. They would talk about it. Friends would be uncomfortable to ask you about that. What I'm saying about that is the fact that with prosecution, one of the things that you then have to find is that Prosecutor General is the sole custodian of prosecutions in this country. They decide to prosecute or not to prosecute. Typically, the Prosecutor General would decline to prosecute if there isn't sufficient evidence to proceed with the case. Because you must remember, a victim of violence, a survivor of violence would be a key witness in those proceedings. And sometimes people withdraw cases because they feel uncomfortable about the interaction that happens between a perpetrator and a victim. And that's one of the other things that we've invested in as the Ministry of Justice, as the Office of the Judiciary and Prosecution, is that we've established victim-friendly courts so that people would, behind the screen, behind, in the comfort of safety, would be able to freely testify. I mean, in that court, the accused person would still be able, or the perpetrator of the violence would still be able to see the person that is testifying, so that they know that the person that is testifying is the right person, because you still want to maintain the decorum of fair trial rights. You want to ensure that the accused person is able to enjoy the rights that he has or she has in that instance. So that is another way that we want to encourage more and more people to come forward and testify. But there is no specific law against withdrawal of cases, but the Prosecutor General decides whether or not to withdraw the case, even if the victim wants to withdraw. But you obviously don't want a victim that doesn't want to participate in the proceedings to be part of your case.
Yeah.
So it's something that we need to raise a little bit more awareness, to explain to people the importance of seeing things through.
Yeah.
For instance, in that instance. Another quick example that I want to make is that in the Domestic Violence Act that deals with protection orders, the Namibian police has a very, very supreme role that they play under that piece of legislation. For example, if somebody has come and applied for a protection order, which is a temporary order that is used to keep people away, that, hopefully it keeps you safe. We've also seen that it's in some instances been very ineffective. People have died while there's a protection order. But in the instance that it works, the police have a responsibility, particularly the station commander in a particular jurisdiction, that if somebody withdraws a protection order or cancels an order or comes and says, I no longer wish to proceed, they have a responsibility to investigate why that is the case, so that they can establish whether or not this person is doing it voluntarily. Because people voluntarily withdrawing a case, you don't really have control over that, but I think you have a responsibility to make sure that this person is doing it not under duress, that this person is safe wherever they find themselves. So that's the context. The Prosecutor General is managing the domestic and gender-based violence aspects under the Criminal Procedure Act and has that responsibility. But I do think that there are bigger questions, societal questions. I must tell you, the Legal Assistance Center has done some good work in investigating and interrogating why women withdraw protection orders. So it may be good for our listeners to find that report and read the reasons why that happens. And we can look at how we can improve to make sure that people don't do that.
Yeah. Perhaps maybe also just share with us within the legal framework, how is the ministry promoting and protecting human rights?
Well, generally, human rights protection is a government and society responsibility. The Namibian Constitution is very clear about, what do Namibians aspire to? Namibians aspire to a caring society that where our women and children are not raped and killed, and our men and boys also are protected from harm, and that we aspire to life, dignity, and the pursuit of happiness, freedom, liberty, justice, and because we aspire to that, our Constitution and all of the various international instruments that Namibia has ratified. Namibia is excellent at ratifying international instruments, and what we've done is we have made sure that we put in place policy arrangements. National gender policy is an example, legal arrangements, the rape, domestic violence legislation is an example, institutional arrangements, the work, the fabulous work that the Prosecutor General's office is doing, the fabulous work that the Namibian police are doing. I mean, there are limitations, obviously, but I think we've got the basic framework in place to ensure that we invest in those three key areas of work to ensure that the rights of our people are protected.
All right. You are tuning into your favorite radio station, 99 FM, in case you're just tuning in right now. We're talking to the Minister of Justice in the Republic of Namibia on this segment tonight of MYD Heart, of course, as we basically talk about the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, which is an annual campaign that happens. And for this year, the theme is Unite, Invest to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls. Perhaps, Minister Dausab, what steps are being taken to ensure that legal aid is accessible to those who cannot afford legal representation, especially due to the high demand?
So that's a very important question, because legal aid is part of that's one of our key service centers as the Ministry of Justice. Just for the viewers on social media platforms, but also our listeners this evening, is that it's important that our listeners understand that legal aid is based on two things. The first one is we establish whether or not a case has merit, and you'd imagine that if a particular client comes with a case of domestic or gender-based or sexual violence, that we must establish whether there's enough evidence to prove that case in court, because remember, we are paying someone to go to court on behalf of the client. And the second thing is a means test. And that's usually where the problem is. Our threshold is 3,500. You must have a net income of 3,500. That means anything above that. If you're earning 3,700, we have to it's kind of the cutoff point. Okay. And then there's a responsibility on the client to contribute 350 so that they can just take some responsibility for the work that we're going to be doing on their behalf by outsourcing and or using our legal aid counsel in-house. Now, what then typically happens is that legal aid has resource limitations. Every year, up to now, from April until now, we had 10,200 applications for legal aid. And we've only been able to approve about, I believe, between 5,000 and 7,000 of those applications. So there's close to 4,000 people that don't get legal aid. And that's only, and the financial year is not even over. So we will be counting that until March next year. So you can imagine that there's going to be a continuous inflow of requests for legal aid. What we've tried to do as the Ministry of Justice is we've recently concluded a memorandum of understanding with the Law Society of Namibia. And we try and encourage the independent legal profession that is being managed by the Law Society, that they must do their part. Because firstly, legal aid is a corporate social responsibility. So when we appoint legal aid lawyers outside of legal aid counsel, in-house counsel, we are expecting our lawyers to be a little bit more lenient with the manner in which they are charging our fees, because then we can help a bit more people. The pool can be made bigger. But if we are spending, millions on one lawyer, then we are unable to instruct more lawyers for more people to have access. But we do hope that more of our lawyers, independent ones, would start doing some pro bono work, so that, and I'm hoping that this memorandum of understanding with the Law Society would open up the pathway for us to do that. And I think, so legal aid, what we've not considered, and that's something that we need to think about in the next cycle of the gender policy, gender equality, and all of that policy that's going to come up from the Ministry of Gender Equality, is that we need to think about what role, how can we maybe improve or reform the legal aid legislation to consider issues of gender-based violence as important. I remember, though, I believe it was in 2012 when the Law Reform and Development Commission, I wasn't there at the time, had done what I considered to be a preliminary report on gender-based violence. And one of the things that was recommended in that report, if I'm not mistaken, was that we must consider providing legal aid to all victims of violence. But that will require Treasury to increase the amount of money that is allocated to legal aid, because legal cost is mammoth. It's massive within our context, and so you'd want to make sure that you have enough funds. If you're going to make that kind of commitment, which I believe we can, then we should have the resources. And resources don't just have to come from Treasury. It can also come from the independent legal profession and other development partners in the country and elsewhere, so that we can increase the resource pool and have more people access legal aid.
And what you say is the ministry ensuring accountability and transparency when it comes to legal proceedings?
So legal proceedings are in the purview of the Office of the Judiciary, as you know, and that's an important independent state organ. just like the executive and the legislature are. And so the Office of the Judiciary was extricated, if you'd like, in 2015 from the Ministry of Justice, because we wanted to buttress the importance of the independence of the judiciary. We wanted to reaffirm the principle of separation of powers.
Yeah.
We wanted to ensure that we have a judiciary that is independent, impartial, objective, has integrity, and is competent. That judiciary is managed by the Chief Justice and the Judicial Service Commission. And, any concerns that members of the public have about the proceedings, those are the two key institutions, the Chief Justice and the Judicial Service Commission, that members of the public can complain to. But what is important to note is that during that process, the built-in safeguard is, if you are not happy with the outcome of a decision of the court, you can appeal, or you can take it on review. And if you have serious concerns, you can write to the Judicial Service Commission and the Chief Justice and raise those concerns. I mean, some of the developments that we see today around the judiciary opening up, even the appointment of judges, a very, very noble and important development within our judicial system is the fact that, we have a Chief Justice clearly that listens, that I'm not responsible for, that I'm independent from. But what we try and do as the executive is to ensure that we provide the support, which is a constitutional imperative. So we are not going to interfere with the judiciary, their decisions and the way they run their affairs, but we must provide the support that they need so that they can do their work properly.
Yeah. And just finally as well, how is the government working to balance the need for public safety with the principles of rehabilitation and reintegration in the criminal justice system?
So the criminal justice system has a number of key players. And when you're talking about that particular aspect, you're talking about safety and security, you're talking about correctional services. And, I can tell you, about 2 months ago, I had, on the invitation of the Commissioner General, I had visited the prison service, and the correctional service, rather. And I must tell you, I was impressed with the two things that impressed me was the quality of staff that the Commissioner General has around them. Very, very professional individuals in various aspects. So psychosocial support, they have workshops, impressive work that they do. So that tells you that the correctional services activities are geared towards reintegration of a person that has been an inmate into society so that they're able to sustain themselves. And then what they also do is rehabilitation. But that's really a conversation that you should have with Commissioner General so that he can give you a bit more detail. I was just as impressed. There are problems, obviously, in the correctional services that people are complaining about, and inmates write to me all the time about the concerns that they have. But I think we must celebrate the good things that happens there. Around the issue of safety and security, I think, again, that's a responsibility of the minister responsible for safety and security and the Namibian police. But I think there are efforts. If you look at, because sometimes it's really just about what kind of leadership you have in place. And I think we have the right people in those positions to ensure that we have some safety. We need to increase, obviously, our safety concerns. Recently, and it's linked to gender-based violence and domestic violence and rape, is the fact that our crime rate in the country is increasing, is rising, exponentially, and people are worried that increase is also increasing violence at home, for instance. So there's some serious room for improvement around safety concerns. But I think what we also need to talk to people about, and this is the importance of these kinds of campaigns, is that you need to raise awareness about the key things that are causing us these problems. What is the problem around violence.
Right.
How do men see violence and how do women see violence?
Yeah.
How do we resolve disputes, for example? What should be the role of our traditional authorities in maybe not harmful cultural practices, but what were some of the good things that were done in the past by our ancestors, by our parents,
right.
For example, by our older generation of people that, maybe kept violence at a minimum. How did they respond to issues of domestic violence, for instance?
Yeah.
What is the kind of lessons, what is the kind of conversations that we're having, whether we are sitting in bars or in church or at home, or we are playing with friends or we are out with friends? What are the kinds of conversations that we're having?
Yeah.
What is it that our children see when a man and a woman is living together in a house? What do our children see? How do men and women interact with each other in front of the boy child, in front of the girl child, for instance? It's these conversations that we need to have. Law is important. I think the Ministry of Justice is doing what it needs to do, and every chance I get, I do talk about these issues so that we can just raise consciousness around the issues that we're having. But I think the conversations really need to go back to a societal, family level.
There we go. A lot of things to ponder on with that very closing statement there. The 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence runs between the 25th of November, which is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, leading up to Human Rights Day, or International Human Rights Day, which is commemorated annually on the 10th of December. And of course, sharing with us more on how we can really all strive in addressing this global pandemic was the Minister of Justice in the Republic of Namibia, that is Honourable Yvonne Dausab. Thank you so much for taking our time to talk to us. Thank you so much for the work that you do, and we cannot wait to talk to you again.
An important conversation, and I hope all Namibians will unite against violence against women, children, boys and men.
There we go. And that was MYD Heart here on your favorite radio station with NHP on 99 FM.
MYD Heart was proudly brought to you by NHP. NHP, we are about you.